which I know our Russian colleagues who were here last week had a bit of a tough time because I believe it was really late into the night. So maybe they could benefit from the. Yeah, I was hoping Roman would be here, but it's okay. Nice to see you all. Hey, Gabriel, Scott, Ted. Oh, Ted, hey. Yeah, it's really nice to see you. Fassandra. Hi, Fassandra. Mark, Daniel, thanks. So last week, I think what I was really trying to focus on in retrospect was the difference between the symbolic unconscious and the real unconscious. And it's the Simone, hi. I always love when I see you pop into these groups. So good to see you here, Simone. I think it's also, so the symbolic and real unconscious, it's also the difference between a typewriter and a bubble. But what type of difference is it? I was thinking about, mostly because I had a brief chat with Gabriel the other day that I really benefited from. I was thinking about something Alenka Stupancic said about feminine sexuation. The difference that makes a difference. Hugh, hello. So good to see you, Hugh. The difference that makes a difference. I think it was an advancement beyond the impasses of gender theory that now populate the political field. But this difference that makes a difference. It was described as if it concerned an inherent negativity. Alenka Stupancic once said during an interview, I have the quote in front of me, sexual difference is not simply difference between sexes as individual entities, but more fundamentally, the negativity involved in the constitution of these individual entities. Sexuation is the way in which this negativity, or difference that makes a difference, is inscribed into positive entities. Otherwise, you'd be back to difference as if it were a difference between individual positive entities, end quote. So I'm looking at the quote and I think first, there's a critique of naive conceptions of sexual difference, taken to mean difference between discrete individuals. Next, in the quote, a more fundamental difference is outlined, which concerns the difference within each discrete individual. And it raises an important question concerning precisely this discrete individual within which we presuppose an inherent negativity. The internal differentiation of an individual, sexuation, is said to be more fundamental, from what I can gather, than the differentiation between individuals. But the fact of there being an inherent negativity, I don't think implies at all that there is no discrete individual about which a presupposition can be made. So in the end, there's a presupposition of an a priori effect of symbolic castration, which returns, I think, us to an antiquated Oedipal field. Now, some of you might feel like you disagree with what I'm saying at this point, but I'll try and develop it so you can see what I mean. I think this Oedipal field is witnessed from a theoretical distance. So in a word, we're supposed to believe, why not bring it up, Gabriel, LGBTQIA+ are internally differentiated, just like anyone else, as if the entire field is Oedipal. So maybe we could claim here that, I don't know, God, I can't believe it. I was listening to Jordan Peterson talk about type 1 and type 2 errors the other day, and it really pissed me off. But now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say, maybe there's a type 1 and a type 2 error here of sorts. Let's begin with the type 2 error. The argument opens up into a false negativity, a faux neg. Maybe it's a feigning, a faux neg. Maybe it's a feigning, but even more, I would say it implies a fawning of jouissance. This fawning of jouissance characterizes much of contemporary revolutionary political philosophy today, even when it presents itself as Lacanian. And what are the consequences? So let's sort of take stock of a few examples, beginning, why not, with LGBTQ+ or LGBTQIA+. This plus in LGBTQIA+ is thought by some, the plus, to be a difference that makes a difference. But maybe what we witness in LGBTQIA+ is a repetition of an encounter of each one all alone with the traumatic and ultimately resisted signifier designated by the plus. So look, we know, for example, that in the earlier period of Lacan's teaching, the signifier had a negative effect, to put it really simply. It was thought to produce a negative effect because it effectuated a no to jouissance. This negativity of the signifier has been taken up within some LGBTQIA+ discourse as if it were something inherently positive. The plus, which stands in for an iteration. There is excess. There's still more to come. Encore. And it's why we can say that the plus, the signifier of the plus, is a fawning of jouissance, a faux neg of jouissance. Acceptance of the signifier in its negative dimension would imply that one offers oneself up to its function, the signifier's function, desaturating, I'm thinking of what Hugh highlighted in something I said last week, saturation of jouissance, desaturating the jouissance and ending the repetition of the series. So let's talk about the type 1 error. I'm using the expression type 1, type 2 errors in a really general, non-scientific way, obviously. But the type 1 error, I don't see why we can't appropriate the language to put it to use for psychoanalysis. There's a faux plus at stake, a faux plus, in what is now referred to as, to take another example, toxic positivity, the discourse surrounding toxic positivity. Ultimately, toxic positivity is a consequence of the fawning of jouissance, I claim. It concerns the repetition of jouissance, even when we presuppose its drainage, as in the case of theories of constitutive negativity. So, for example, take the theoretical implementations of this Freudian death drive. Hi, Aaron. These theories of Freudian death drive, which often get taken up by theorists today as if it were an antidote to toxic positivity within political, philosophical, even sociological Lacanianism. Can we say that this theoretical depiction of the death drive is actually a fawning of jouissance? I think it's deployed often in such a way as to ensure continued resistance to the traumatic signifier. So in these cases, death drive becomes a theoretical defense against the experience of the real. And I think we should be prepared to admit that jouissance is resolutely positive. I think it might be difficult to convince some people about this unless you kind of were willing to go to the end. Because at the end, what you encounter is the faux plat, the faux plus, the false positive, as a final defense against the real. What is the faux plus? There's two really good related jokes from a controversial Canadian comedian, a late Norm Macdonald. Maybe you've heard of him. That can really help us understand what's at stake in the faux plus. I'm going to tell each joke in my own way. First joke. My friends told me that I drink too much, I drink too much alcohol or something like that. So my friends told me I drink too much alcohol. They convinced me to go to Alcoholics Anonymous, an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. Good. Members at the meeting told me that I should first admit that I'm an alcoholic. First stage, admit that you're an alcoholic. I said, never. They asked me, why would you say that? And I said, because that's only what alcoholics say. It's not that funny, maybe, but that's the first joke. The second joke. My friend Bill was suffering from alcoholism. When I heard this, and Norm Macdonald says, when I heard this, I always like to look on the bright side of life. I said, hey, Bill, look, I know you have this terrible disease and everything, alcoholism, but I think you have the best one. That's the joke. Okay, what are these two jokes about? I think they're about the repetition of jouissance in what is called addictions, and about the endless avoided encounter with the signifier. This faux plus is recognized by Norm Macdonald in the statement, for example, I am an alcoholic. It's a faux plus. It's a saturation of jouissance. So the joke, I don't think the joke demonstrates an insensitivity to those who are suffering from addictions or anything like that. It's not. It demonstrates precisely that addictions is a terrible disease. It is terrible, precisely because it's the best one. That's why it's terrible. You enjoy it too much. That's the point. It's terrible because it's so great. You suffer from the positivity of the disease more than its negative consequences. So there's a defense against relinquishing the positivity to the negativity of the world. And in the end, I think these jokes, they're jokes about the difficulty of admitting any negativity into the world that might desaturate the fawning of jouissance. The fawning of jouissance. So, on the one hand, faux plus, what I'm calling faux plus, it's in the place where the true negativity of the signifier would have been. And on the other hand, the fawning is in the place where a true positive perpetuates. And it's precisely what I think we find increasingly under the banner of theories of the death drive today. So, they like to say in America, don't get it twisted. This is, I think, what's happening. You're getting it twisted a little bit. In the mid-1990s, Jacques-Alain Miller, he took pains to demonstrate that Lacan eventually abandoned the Freudian theory of the death drive. Precisely for this reason, I think, in favor of the concept, what he took from death drive, jouissance. I'll quote him. What is striking is that Lacan, proceeding into the dark zone, abandons the Freudian language of the drives. From the Freudian drive, he extracts jouissance, end quote. I think it's a provocative statement, especially because death drive is so popular today among our comrades, as a theory, as a concept, and so on, among our comrades. So maybe you're not willing to follow Jacques-Alain Miller or the late Lacan, maybe in this particular direction, but you should at least admit that there's something to it. Like, For Lacan, the death drive was linked to demand and to the subject of the signifier, which was a subject represented for another signifier. So it was ultimately a Freudian device, which operates out there in the Freudian field. So I'm not proposing that we abandon the theory of the death drive. That's not what I'm saying. But we should abandon our theoretical presuppositions about the death drive. Today, you know what's really interesting to me? Today, we're reading from our friends. Finally, we're reading at this particular moment in our thinking, we're reading from our friends that we finally should do away with the Lacanian concept of jouissance. It's time to get rid of it. And it seems to me that this is a political attack upon Lacanian psychoanalysis. It's an attempt to decouple from the other Lacan, and it's an attack upon the Lacanian unconscious. And even, I would say, maybe you won't believe me, the objet petit a, which was Lacan's central invention. Maybe I can convince you of that before the end of today. I have to develop it though. It's a retreat from jouissance. What we're witnessing is a retreat from jouissance as a Fawning political strategy designed to reduce the positivity of jouissance into a presupposition of constitutive negativity. But does it succeed? Does this political strategy succeed? I'm not convinced. This entire effort, I think, is to eradicate jouissance, not as a concept, but as an experience. And in the end, that's what cannot, under any circumstance, be done. You cannot eradicate the jouissance of the other. It returns, and that's when the trauma occurs. And I think, as I said last week, trauma is at the very core of our political crises today. The plus in LGBTQIA+, it marks the weakening function of the signifier, which has become saturated in jouissance. So what's outside of that discrete configuration, LGBTQ+? What's outside of it? A threatening world. A threatening world is what's outside of it. So those who would claim that the concept of jouissance lacks clarity and that it conflates rather than distinguishes, to use a quote from somebody who proposed that maybe we do away with the concept of jouissance. He said, there's a problem because it conflates rather than distinguishes. They nonetheless, the people who claim that, find themselves saturated in the jouissance of the other. They continuously wrestle with it. And it even compels them to write books about which they try so desperately to reject the jouissance of the other. And I would say that my discourse, or what there is of it, aims to puncture a hole. It's not something written on a page, but it's a hole puncher. Attempting to punch holes into these rectangular books when it's possible to do so. How can we distinguish the concept of jouissance from surplus jouissance? How can we distinguish it? On the one hand, surplus jouissance. Slavoj has a new book coming out, I think, with Bloomsbury on surplus jouissance. On the one hand, surplus jouissance can be taken as a remnant of jouissance, while jouissance as such is saturating. But it's always possible that the surplus can be taken as if it were a faux plus. So I would ask the following question, it's rhetorical for now. What do we make of this jouissance that saturates the book during the book's very attempt to do away with it? The one who wrote the book witnesses the Lacanian unconscious from a distance, as if outside of it. And yet there in the book, we're drowning in jouissance, just trying tirelessly to do away with. The book is about nothing else except for jouissance. And it's why I claim that books are saturated in jouissance. Defenses against the negativity of the signifier. The book today is a defense against the signifier. By the way, what was it? What was it that Duane Rousselle taught us when he wrote his it was a really interesting book on the topic of depression. What was it called? The New Black. Is that it? Yes, Simone, is that it? Maybe there's another one too, The New Black. What is it that he ultimately offers us? It's a really clever book. It seems to me, though, that Lacan leads us toward a different conception of, say, depression. Leads us toward a different conception of depression, one that's not essentially about loss. It's why there's a stubbornness in our theoretical understandings of depression, especially when we try and do away with the concept of jouissance. When I hear people speak about depression, you know, there's even some people who celebrate it as a revolutionary concept. Let's be real about depression. You're more in touch with reality and so on. It's a certain realism, a non-dupery. It's clear to me that there's a relinquishment of the traumatic encounter with the signifier. Russell Grigg made a clear point, I don't know, a few decades ago, about depressive melancholia. He said that depression for Lacan, it's a really clear point, it's ultimately not marked by loss, as in the loss of the object, which would make it a variation on the logic of mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, mourning. Depressive melancholia is marked by an unbearable proximity to the object. So it's an inability to separate from the Fawning of jouissance, of one's jouissance, since that would imply courage, even political courage, to offer oneself up to the negativity of the signifier. It's courage against depression. I don't know if it's moral courage. That makes depression maybe one of the penultimate experiences of toxic positivity. And it's not something that you can exactly convince. You wouldn't be capable of convincing a depressed one. You can't, under any circumstance, convince the depressed one that they're suffering from too much happiness or positivity. You won't be able to convince them of that. But that's exactly what frequently, I think, occurs in depression today. You'll even notice that the depressed one has built up an entire life to convince themselves that it's the world that's too positive, the world in place of the positive. All the more to avoid the negativity of that world. And it's why today, I think maybe even today's psychoanalyst functions, I said a hole puncher, maybe as a hole puncher, but maybe also as a toxicologist, rather than say a surgeon. The jouissance of that's at stake in the experiences of depression aims toward continuity with the other, such that the other must speak the same theory, the same language, maybe wear the same clothes, the same colors, and so on. When the other refuses the continuity or the consistency, you're shocked. And at this point, you witness the abandonment of the other's negativity. And it means that I think even that the psychoanalyst aims at traumatization. The very delicate politics of traumatization, very delicate. you have to discover the means through which the traumatization can occur, because without it, there can be no subject of politics. So in the end, we could say that the depressed one interprets the negativity of the world as a faux pleu. For this person, the world is actually profoundly negative and threatening, but a false optimism is projected into the world in order to justify one's retreat. So she retreats. The depressed one retreats from the other in order to institute her positive world, her, he, they, positive world, against which they position themselves as the true negative. So I think the psychoanalyst must learn to recognize that this one is not at all the true negative that she presents herself to be. She's a Fawning. So it's why I think we can even claim that some depressed people actually suffer from stubborn happiness. The subject is happy. Subject is happy. Lacan put it like that when he spoke about the subject of the drive. Subject of the drive is happy. I'm reminded of a nightmare I once had, which I'll share with you. In my nightmare, a woman was smiling, laughing, dancing, mocking me in public. I was trembling, crying, which only intensified the laughters, the smile. She was screaming at me, "You're such a woman. You're such a woman." And maybe that's what troubles heterosexual men today, some heterosexual men today, that women are happy. They are. So it's the opposite of what maybe you know it, the comedian, controversial comedian Bill Burr once said about heterosexual women. He said they can't stand that men are happy. He's got it twisted. There may also be that dimension. Men are happy, but in a more psychoanalytic sense, we can say that women are happy. Anyway, after the nightmare, I noticed for the first time the wonderful smile on my psychoanalyst's face. I accepted it, the jouissance of the other. It became a bit more bearable. It makes me think of two films which Mark brought to my attention recently, The Wicker Man and Midsummer. You know these films? If you watch these films, I think you'll understand what's at stake in Lacan's claim the subject is happy. It should be taken in the register of feminine jouissance. This feminine jouissance became, for Lacan, in his later teaching, jouissance as such. So I'm suggesting that we move from feminine sexuation in some sense, which I began today talking about, to jouissance as such, which is not exclusive to those who are biologically women, according to biological discourse. Lacan discussed the happiness of the subject of the drive in relation to a logic of repetition. It should be taken as the repetition of the faux pleu, doomed to repeat its traumatic encounter with the signifier that's been foreclosed. So if psychoanalysis operates upon the discontents of civilization, then perhaps it's alone in allowing this traumatization to occur for the one all alone. Psychoanalytic politics perhaps relates to a politics of trauma. Maybe. The production of a whole in the excessive void, the production of a whole in the excessive void without recourse to the perpetuation of the series of feigned encounters with the signifier. And that's what the signifier produces in the void. It produces a whole. Surplus can be a really wonderful defense against jouissance as such. But in the end, it doesn't hold. The signifier is reduced to its jouissance in the repetition of the series until it can finally become isolated as one, all alone, without repetition. You know, obviously, some of you already know this, the word trauma or traumatism, trauma in the French, Lacan highlighted it, it's a homophone with the, it sounds like the word whole. And Lacan mentioned it several times. What is trauma? It occurs as a consequence of an encounter with the no into the real of the void after the no has been refused in the symbolic. So in such a case, we can say that the signifier didn't know because it's the one who knows. No? When Freud said that the unconscious, or sorry, Lacan said that the unconscious is politics, he wasn't speaking about the Freudian unconscious. He wasn't. He was speaking about the Lacanian unconscious. It's an important point, and it's important to be reminded about that. He said it explicitly. And it's important to remember that when we're rereading, for example, this Lacan's seminar on the logic of fantasy, I've extracted a passage from it that I'll read to you now. It's a longer one, so bear with me. It's a quote, "It's a matter of convincing people that they are quite wrong not to want to be admitted to the benefits of capitalism. They prefer to be rejected," he says with an exclamation point in the Cormac Gallagher translation. Perhaps there's a moment when people will come back to a sound perception of what Freud discovered for us. Lacan continues, "I'm not even saying politics is the unconscious, but quite simply, the unconscious is politics." He continues, "I mean that what binds men together or what opposes them is precisely justified by that whose logic we are trying for the moment to articulate. This means that before noting the fact that in order to be rejected, for the to be rejected, to be essential as a dimension for the neurotic, the following, in any case, is essential, that he offers himself up." That's the quote. For there to be rejected as an essential dimension for the neurotic, it's essential that he offers himself up. End quote. Okay. So for psychoanalysis, this logic, let's spell it out. It doesn't hold. A equals B is not, let's say, homologous with B equals A in psychoanalysis. We can't say A equals B is the same as B equals A in psychoanalysis. So in the first case, in this quote, he said, "I dare not say politics is the unconscious, but that the unconscious is politics." In the first case, the unconscious, let's call it B, it's taken as, I don't know, like a noun, which means that it's a device, the Freudian one. Politics is the unconscious. That's politics is the unconscious, or A equals B. But the unconscious is politics, makes politics the one, the thing. The unconscious isn't operative except in the field, which is the Freudian field. And what Freud named neurosis, is maybe just another name for offering oneself up to symbolic castration, even when you can't live with the consequences. So neurosis simply means that one has been admitted into the benefits of the modern social bond. And that's what Freud claimed. As in my reading, he claimed that. There are benefits from the illness of civilization, the benefits from illness. The benefit from illness. And he often tried to convince his patients that they benefited from their illnesses. The benefit from illness. We saw it particularly in his when he discussed the self-victimization, to put it simply, of hysterical patients. And I would say that one of the benefits of the modern social bond was the production of surplus objects. So what does Lacan say about surplus jouissance in his 17th seminar, moving from the logic of fantasy to the 17th seminar? I think he affects, we already kind of know this, it's a simple thing, but I'll say it anyway. He affects a very clear separation of jouissance from surplus jouissance. But he says it very clearly in the 17th seminar. It's not a new argument that I'm presenting. We already presume most of us, that when we're talking about surplus jouissance, it's a remnant of jouissance. We already kind of, a jouissance that was lost, maybe. That's how we already kind of suppose it to be, or presuppose it to be. But I wonder if this distinction between jouissance and surplus jouissance really helps us in the end. Does jouissance ever really become lost? It's just an open question. On the one hand, surplus jouissance gives us the benefit of making a distinction in jouissance. But jouissance as such remains without there being the ability to make a conceptual distinction regarding our experience of it. And it's something that Lacan, there was something Lacan already said in his ethics seminar. When jouissance, in the ethics seminar, jouissance was thought to be outside of the confines of, the phallic Oedipal world, accessible only through transgression in the ethics seminar. That's how we commonly read it. The psychoanalytic act was thought to consist, to put it really simply, of a transgression beyond, the laws of the phallic world into jouissance as such, dusting, whatever. This surplus, by the way, why not? I'm thinking spontaneously, why not? Why don't we call surplus a separation that does not make a separation? Surplus is the separation that does not make a separation. This surplus is also a recuperation of an original surplus into the faux plus. And Lacan says in his seminar on fantasy that when there's no transgression, when there is no transgression, then one falls into something, he says, not unlike jouissance, a surplus. When there's no transgression, you fall into something not unlike jouissance, a surplus. It means that when you don't go to the end, you don't transgress into the psychoanalytic act, whatever. There's perhaps the benefit of surplus jouissance when you don't go to the end. In the ethics seminar, transgression was this act beyond the phallic world into jouissance as such. And it was what led some, I got a book in the mail today, it's behind me here, Zizek's book on Antigone. I admit I haven't read it yet. He rewrites the Antigone play, so I need to read it to see if I'm just talking bullshit, which is very likely. But it leads some to identify Antigone as a heroic revolutionary figure who transgressed. I disagree fundamentally. I propose to you that Antigone was not at all a revolutionary figure of Lacanian politics. She's a revolutionary figure only from the idiotic perspective of the Freudian unconscious, the world of phallic jouissance. And it's why some circumambulate around Antigone in their phallic revolutionary sentiments. Perhaps Lacan even wasn't prepared to reject the hypothesis. I'm really sounding scientific today. Maybe Lacan wasn't even prepared to reject the hypothesis that Antigone wasn't at all a figure of revolution, but maybe she was a figure of fascism. He didn't rule it out in my reading. Hugh, I see you're here, so I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, Hugh. I know Hugh's been working for quite a long time on the ethics seminar in a cartel. He's got a very close reading of this seminar. So I would ask, I mean, if you're up for it after today, like after I'm done my bullshit, maybe you could maybe say something about this if you remember, because I think there's a statement where Lacan mentions, I don't know if it was a colleague or somebody mentions it in passing, that his friend thinks Antigone might have been a fascist. But correct me if I'm wrong. It's a memory. I think I mentioned it to you before. I might be wrong. So anyway, I'd love to hear what you have to say about all this stuff, Antigone and the ethics seminar and so on. But so, you know, I guess my question for Hugh would be in the discussion section today. What do you make of this passing statement from Lacan, if it did exist? Maybe I'm inventing it, I don't know. That concerning Antigone's fascism. Anyway, I wonder if the problem is that contemporary capitalism doesn't impose any signifier that one can find acceptable. And so for that reason, we simply refuse to offer ourselves up to it. And perhaps our political task is to locate a signifier that would puncture a hole into the void of our contemporary discontents. And I would ask all of you for later in the discussion. It's a question. Really interested in what Daniel has to say in the discussion on this too, if you're open to it. I know you have a lot to say because of your new book on the family and so on. But the question is capitalism a social bond based upon prohibitions? Is it? Or is it based upon weakening prohibitions? Or is it based upon affirmations of jouissance? I think we need a really clear answer on this. And I think we should refuse to be indecisive. Is there a nom du père or is there not a nom du père? Yes or no? Are there many names of the father? And if so, how many are operative in the political field today? And to what degree of relative efficiency can we say? And where are they? What does it tell us about global politics if there are, in fact, many nom du père which function to relative degrees of efficiency or whatever? So I'm just kind of leaving these questions open, but without refusing to take them up in each our own way. Anyway, I want to return to this discussion of the seminar on the logic of fantasy. It was a point in Lacan's teaching that I would say there was a point in Lacan's teaching where he already advanced beyond the impasse of the phallic world. He went beyond his ethics seminar. Revolutionary, you know, at a certain moment, revolutionary sentiments start bubbling up in France, bubbling up. He probably took notice of it through his patients, of which he had many, a surplus of patients. The year was 1967. Jouissance was no longer thought to be deposited into some inaccessible substratum of the phallic world. It found its way in the 1970s, bubbling up into these little hollows that would be taken up, I know Mark knows, with the Lathous and so on. And it even proposed an eventual sort of equivalence of objet petit a and surplus jouissance and so on. Why? These bubbles of jouissance were becoming accessible to the subject rather than barred from him or her or them. the subject can now hold them in his hand, put them in his pocket, carry them around with him, as we do now with our pocket typewriters. The transgression already happened. The world already ended. The real of jouissance was bleeding into the social bond, eroding it, saturating the signifier that hitherto gave structure to the world. It means that the subject no longer benefited from the illness of his rejection by the signifier that represented him for another signifier. And it's why Lacan eventually stopped saying the subject represented by a signifier for another signifier. Now, I need to go back and check if this is true, but didn't he start saying that the subject was represented to another signifier? I have to go back and check rather than by. But the subject no longer offered herself up to the signifier. Consequently, surplus jouissance was becoming more and more a jouissance as surplus. Or what today I've been calling faux plus. Jouissance as surplus. So I dare not say surplus jouissance, but rather jouissance is surplus. I dare not say surplus jouissance, but rather jouissance is surplus. When one pays the price of being admitted into the social bond through symbolic castration, you're also courageously offering yourself up to the benefits of civilization and its discontents. We allow ourselves to be rejected. And I think it's on this point that we can speak of a subject of politics, or politics of the unconscious, politics of the unconscious. And it's what it means to be admitted into the benefits of capitalism. Look, think about Marx. I feel the need to remind you, maybe I'm wrong. Again, I feel like Daniel can really say something more concrete about this, but didn't Marx in his own way speak about the benefits of capitalism? And yet very few today would consider him to be a capitalist. But we can't say that Marx was anti-capitalist because he wasn't. Capitalism is a benefit. Basically, Marx said, we don't want to return to feudalism, basically. We don't want to return to feudalism. So capitalism is a benefit. And it even led some philosophers, you know them as the accelerationists, to take very seriously this acceleration to the benefits of capitalism. Even some really keen commentators, Nick Cernusek, I'm thinking of, have noted that we have in fact returned to feudalism, into what Cernusek called platform capitalism, a really brilliant pioneering book that came out a long time ago now, but this little book, it's just wonderful. We retreated from the benefits of capitalism. And George Ritzer, the American sociologist, echoing the thought of so many other sociologists, Zygmunt Bauman and so on, called this new form of capitalism prosumer capital. It's a neologism, prosumer, consumer, production, producer, prosumer capitalism, which has the advantage of sounding quite clever, but it doesn't have the advantage of demonstrating clearly that we have made any structural progress from feudalism. Serfs could also have been called prosumers. So what we witness is a repetition of feudalism, its return. It's a new return, yes, it's a new return to feudalism, as every repetition of the real implies. When you repeat, there is something new in the repetition. And it's why we can say El GBTQ. L is different from G, which is different from B, which is different, and so on and so on and so on and so on. We can even, if we like, call the return a dialectic. There's a dialectic there in the return. But it is a return, too. And during this period of Lacan's teaching, the period of the logic of fantasy, and for several years thereafter, Lacan noticed that what was happening was that there was a leakage of jouissance into the social bond, which means that capitalism was becoming liquid capitalism. So you have sociologists talk about liquid capitalism. Today, liquid modernity, the liquid family structure, and so on. It takes liquid for there to be saturation. And then what do you need? You need a flotation device. And Lacan's idea in 1967 was that the benefits of capitalism consist in the production of surplus jouissance. When there's too much liquid, we look for a flotation device, like the Freudian unconscious. Surplus jouissance can be a flotation device. And that's why Lacan's invention, objet petit a, was at one time equated with surplus jouissance. But it's also why Lacan eventually placed the objet petit a at the center of a knot that holds together. Because without the knot, the objet petit a cannot divide the subject. In the third, Lacan's the third, the objet petit a was described by Lacan as that which divides the subject. The objet petit a as that which divides the subject. And he went on, and as that which makes a whole in any theory whatsoever. The objet petit a makes a whole in any theory whatsoever. So it's quite different from the objet petit a as surplus jouissance cut by a phallic signifier, right? Finally, it's the objet petit a, which becomes for Lacan, and he says it quite explicitly, the objet petit a becomes a plug. We have a number of metaphors and analogies at this point, forgive me. The objet petit a is a plug. It produces a hole, but it plugs the void precisely with the hole. Yeah, it plugs the void with a hole. That's it. So ultimately, Lacan came to realize that he was wrong in taking the position that he once did on surplus jouissance. Give me a moment. He was wrong because he didn't yet discover jouissance as such, in terms of its rigidity and fixation, demonstrated in the return of the real to its place, and its repetition along the circuitry of the drive. It means that he realized that surplus jouissance was basically a fawning of jouissance. And it can only hold for so long because jouissance of surplus keeps gushing out. You need to plug the water. Maybe you plug the water with water itself, with ice, maybe. You work the real against itself. That's why jouissance is such a slippery concept, because it's already a surplus, an excess, a positivity. And I would say that if we're willing to go to the end, then we have to return to Freud and to politics. we have to return to the subject of the unconscious. And we do it because we're Lacanian. But to be Lacanian necessitates that we be willing first to go to the end, to discover that the end was already there at the beginning. That's what a return is, a return to the same place. Anyway, I'm thinking that there's probably some of you who are like me right now who doesn't understand a thing of what I'm saying. And maybe there's some of you who'll take what I'm saying today as maybe an insult to some of our friends, or even a critique of them. But I really think what I'm trying to do, it's a deep, deep friendship. It's a deep friendship. So I think if you don't take anything at all from whatever mess I've said today, at least take my smile. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, that was very, very thought-provoking, my friend. And I don't want to be the first one to jump in, although I have, you've given us a lot to work with. And I wanted to invite others to feel free to pop in by just jumping in as you wish. I really, maybe as we as we wait for others to pop in, let me just say maybe one thing, if I could. Can I? Okay, let me. The relationship between signifier and jouissance is an important one. And Duane, I wanted to invite you to say a couple clarifying questions on it, if you don't mind. In Darian Leder's recent book on Jouissance, I don't know if anyone here has had a chance to read it. It's quite interesting. He basically shows that the concept is obviously not original to Lacan, but that he tracks its iterations and he tracks the way that it moves in beginning off with a kind of alterity of even the ethics seminar of the jouissance of the other, all the way to the jouissance of being, to the jouissance of the body, and it kind of takes on, I think, 13 or 14 different specific hyphenated forms, or So I love the Millerian provocation behind the notion that we can say something about the social link of contemporary capitalism and the way that subjectivity relates to jouissance as such differently. So I honor the grounding of that claim in that kind of theory of the discourse of the capitalist. However, I guess my question is kind of, if there is a kind of leaky sense, or a fawning, which is a beautiful term. I think we all understand the notion of hyperbolic, of exaggerated, of unconcealable. Of course, if it is that, the affect of that would it not be a shameful affect, because it's kind of not able to be covered up. So the relationship between the signifier as that which might conceal, like if it drips off of our body, this form of aggressive enjoyment, and aggression is one term to describe it. It's a term that I like, actually. It's very Freudian to call it that, although it's not only aggressive. That is also a sine qua non of what the Kernberg school would refer to as narcissism, as a kind of, for in their language, an aggressivity brought on by a stunted primary narcissistic relationship. So there's a kind of connection there. And I guess my question would be, you pointed out two things. One is a tendency for which we no longer need signifiers to conceal. So there's both a shameful potential, but also a shamelessness, precisely if we don't need a signifier of concealment. Because I think that's actually one of the things that a signifier actually does in a certain way, is that it allows for there not to be a mess in the presentation of your excessive enjoyment. It puts a cap on it, right? It doesn't allow the surplus to run amok, in some sense, which is of course why Lacan would talk about modesty and all of that too. Okay, so it's very interesting what you say, that capitalism does not give us signifiers for which we feel compelled to relate to, comport to, and I wonder if others agree with that. And then my final point would be, yes, it is precisely also the notion, which is why if capitalism is becoming feudal, is it becoming feudal? Because Lacan said that the feudal structure was one where the signifier was in place, where there wasn't an excessiveness. So how do we wrestle with the fact that neo-feudalism, that very problematic thesis which makes every Marxist get red in the face, how do we wrestle with that fact that for Lacan, feudalism was a horizon of a nostalgic form of singularity, of subjectivity, which is ever present in some sense. The conditions of a hyper-capitalist discourse for Lacan, I don't think, bring back a stable signifier, which is what feudalism does. So I don't know if we as Lacanians can say that what's happening is a return to feudalism. At least it's the level of subjectivity. I'll stop there.
I take your point. It's wonderful thoughts. Of course, I'm going to have to think much more on it. I guess have a few sort of very simple, which means a bit stupid points. And one is that the return doesn't have to be in the same way. So that's the first thing. And the second thing would be that I think in some sense, capitalism does seem to offer us signifiers. Take an example that Zizek took from me. He quoted me, so it's okay. I like when he actually quotes me because I need to increase my H index and it's really low. He only ever quotes the email exchange. It's never the work. But that's fine. Maybe that's what a friend does. But he took this example that I brought to his attention maybe a few years ago. Was it 5 years ago? On the light phone. You know, the light phone. It was a product developed. It was called Your Phone Away from Phone. And basically it cost around the same price as an iPhone. Yet, what did it offer you? A Fawning. What it offered was, you could say, is it a signifier? Because ultimately you enjoy your phone too much. You're overwhelmed by your phone, endless messaging. While we're here right now, the vast majority of you are doing other things, I'm sure. And so you get a mess, a lot of noise, and so on. And the idea is the phone away from phone for $800 will offer you a signifier. Let's call it a plus, a phoneme, or a faux plus, which are just it depends which side you're looking at it. What it does is it says, okay, when you're on this phone, you cannot do anything but text or call. Nothing else. It cuts. What Zizek did with my example was really good because he said, yeah, but what you do is you take the phone out and then you go back to your other world again. So you just push the phone off to the side, down the chain a little bit. And there's a surplus of these objects in the market now, of course. I was at a conference in California 7 years ago on modernism. And mostly Ivy League scholars there. And they had all these sessions on the practices of academics and how to get your paper out. It was mostly showcasing all of these new apps that you can get, whose function is to block Facebook and all these other things. We all know the workarounds and so on. Does it work in the end? Is the question. What happened to the light phone? It was really popular for a little while. I haven't heard of it in a few years. So I would say that that's a Fawning of, so what you get is, okay, does capitalism offer you signifiers? Yeah, but they're saturated in jouissance. It's just a temporary reprieve, you know, a little moment. So I think that's really all I could say. I think your point is ahead of my thinking here, obviously, but I got to catch up to it.
So sorry, one more. So the three operative terms, which might help configure this, at least in my mind, would be signifier, jouissance, and objet A. There's a depletion of the efficacy of signifiers to order, if we might use that term, surplus jouissance. Surplus jouissance, of course, is produced. We can talk about the way that it oscillates and that it exchanges and produces, that it absorbs us. The plus is the objet A, and I would love to talk more about the plus and like the plus as what precisely? It's not the fawning, because it seems more of an attempt of an organization of the fawning. The fawning is more acephalic, is it not? The fawning is, you know, maybe the question is the relationship between the objet A and the deficient signifier would be my, but maybe Mark can help us with this.
Yeah.
Mark, forgive me. Just one quick more point, because I want to be clear. I don't think signifiers are not out there. I think they are, because we see them precisely in moments of crisis, trauma, political crises that animate our world today. You can think of all kinds of examples. If I mention them, it will be triggering. So I think the signifiers are out there, but we witness them from a distance. And so they're not here. And that's the point I'm trying to make. And I'll give you an example of a wonderfully revolutionary television show. It's another example that Zizek took from me, but didn't cite from my book, from an email exchange, but he did cite me. It was an episode of Black Mirror. Sorry, Mark, I'll just be a moment. In Black Mirror, what happens? Well, there's this episode, it's called Nosedive. And if I remember it correctly, what's happening in it is a woman, she's endlessly kind of having to demonstrate that she's enjoying herself. She's really fawning and so on. And she just can't do it anymore. She reaches this moment of absolute burnout. She cries, whatever else. And where does she end up? In the prison. She ends up in prison at the end, and the music gets really nice, and she has this giant smile on her face. It's a beautiful moment where she's imprisoned. She's imprisoned, and she's in the prison house of language at the end, I think. She's in the prison house of language. And so I think that that's a political moment, and it's a revolutionary moment. And I would say if there's a politics today, it perhaps involves finding our prison house, finding our prisons. Mark, go ahead.
No, this is no, it's just really, really interesting, and I know that a lot of what you're talking about, it's free flowing and it's ideas that you're working with now, and I find it really interesting. So, my own summary of what you're getting at, and maybe someone else can jump in and fill in the gaps. But what my initial these ideas of saturation for me, for the beginning, seminar 7, it was the ethics seminar. It's an ethics of constitutive negativity. Well, I think what you're trying to do is talk of a different ethics. It's talk about how we engage in an ethics of saturation or dealing with saturation, a positive ethics. It's a positive ethics. And I think for me, as putting my theological cap on it, I was talking to you about this, Tubal Cain, Genesis 4:22. Tubal Cain, he knew, or that the Canaanite civilization, it was going to die. They were going to die. They were going to get drowned out. They were going to get drowned and saturated. But what did Tubal Cain do? He just produced. He was an artificer. He made endless plugs, and then they were drowned. Then the Canaanite civilization was drowned out. But I think for me, the core of your argument is about how we are happy. We are happy. And it is in that happiness we suffer. And so there's a misrecognition of a saturation that is wrecking the social bond. And so we end up seeing this saturation as a series of negatives, this constant series of negatives. And I think what you're saying is that the benefits of capitalism are beneficial because they allow us to imagine escaping this saturation. The need to escape creates the place of the drive, which endlessly repeats again and again and again as we reach out for flotation devices, right? Surplus jouissance, as an example of the constitutive negative, offers a flotation device. It's a way of trying to save ourselves from drowning. It's an avoidance of the horror of the positivity of the void with the creation of holes that plug it. This is what I'm sort of getting from it, and I don't know if anyone else can jump in or if anyone else can chip in. But I think what you're saying, it makes a lot of sense to me. I think it makes a lot of sense because it's trying to talk about this. There is a level of positivity everywhere. And I think the biggest transition for me in this field of capitalism at a purely experiential level, if in the 1990s it was about enjoying yourself in this sort of way, just consume. Now we're seeing this sort of perpetuation. We talked about it last time of a type of endless repetition of self-care, the language of trauma as a type of commodity itself, a type of flotation device to distract us from the horror, the void itself. And it's everywhere. And, that's all I've got to say. And I'm going to shut up now. So if someone else wants to kick in, I'm happy. It's all right.
Thanks so much, Mark. I would only say I agree with you. We're not in a holy age. Aaron?
Yes, I kind of once again just want to, I don't know, maybe more than anything, test whether I think I'm following you correctly, but also maybe provide a few further points of departure for further debate. So the issue, taking up the issue of distinguishing the folklore versus, jouissance in general, or I don't know, surplus jouissance versus jouissance with, I don't know, capital J or something. Let's just call it the other jouissance. Anyway, I wanted to take up the issue of maybe trying to explain this via, and I think this has probably been, taken up by people like Samo Tomczyk, but I think one way of potentially broaching this subject is to think in terms of the expansion of credit. Obviously, credit is key to the, kind of capitalist circuit of production in general. It's a precondition for capitalist production, but it's also been expanded since the 1970s, increasingly among, everyday consumers. And so I made a note of this. The faux plus of credit keeps us on castration's leading strings, but slave to the object a. That is, by way of credit, we remain bound to the logic of the imaginary, to the logic of transcendental illusion, which is that of credit, which effectively suspends capital as antinomy of purchase and sale, and for the analysand, the antinomic relation of drive and desire. Moreover, with the demise of the signifier, which is opaque, the problem of the other, of the final exchange, is displaced. And I made a note, Lacan reflects this condition into the clinic. There is a limit to, however, the way he thinks the homology of politics and the unconscious, precisely in the fact that the phallic signifier is without signified, while money annihilates signification altogether. And so one thing I was curious about, Duane, is how you take up, the kind of, that last term in particular, the antinomic relation between the signifier in general and money, how one is with one, in one sphere, say, analysis, we concentrate on, say, something like the phallic signifier, which is without signified. While, as Lacan famously said in the Seminar and Purloined Letter, money annihilates signification altogether.
Wow, I'm blown away by this analysis. I don't think I could say anything better than that. I really, I feel like what you're saying, to me, it feels, unfortunately, very consistent with what I'm trying to get to. I don't have the economic analysis that you have. I think I can't add anything to it. But I'll take it. I'll take it. Thank you so much for that. That was really c'est bon. Hugh?
Hi, hi all. Hi, Duane. Everybody hear me okay? Yeah. You can hear me okay? Yeah, Grant. This technology is a bit antiquated, so that's why I have to use this microphone. It's kind of patchwork technology, I'm afraid I'm not quite sure I can do justice to your Antigone question, because our cartel is just about to start the Antigone section, although I looked at it many years ago. I'll come back to it. Maybe just one or two things that struck me, really fascinating, some fascinating provocations, if you like. The first thing that, maybe taking it up from last week, I really like this statement. The book today is a defense against the signifier. Which kind of very much linked in, I think, to your notion that today the signifier is saturated in jouissance, But I wonder, maybe you might develop that notion that the book is a defense against the signifier, Maybe you might develop that. I'd be very interested to hear you develop that. I thought what you said about depression was really interesting also, in that I think probably following Lacan, but that it was not so much the loss of the object, but too much of the object. The object is too present, The one I have lost colonizes my mind, he is not lost. They're actually too present, But I think that's actually very true to Freud. I think in the Morning and Melancholia paper, when he talks about depression or melancholy as the identification with the lost object, It's not so much the loss of the object as the absolute radical identification with the object. to such an extent that, as he puts it famously, you know, the shadow of the object falls upon the ego, you know. I'm completely colonized by the lost object. So therefore it's not lost, it actually devours me, you know, in a sense. That was really interesting. But also as a Freudian myself, I think very true to Freud. I just want to link it back to the Freudian root. Okay, the big question, Antigone. And I can only throw out one or two scraps really of half thoughts. The question, I think the question you raised was, or I think you made the point that, or you suggested that Antigone is not ultimately a revolutionary. Yeah, I think that's a hypothesis you floated. Yeah, and then the second one is, was she in some sense a fascist? Yeah. There's not much I can say about the second one, I'm afraid. But the first question is of Antigone as a revolutionary. I think if we go back to Seminar 7, Lacan's notion of jouissance here is very much linked to transgression, okay? Jouissance and transgression are very much interlinked in this particular seminar, you know. This means also that jouissance here is linked to the symbolic, okay? Okay, there has to be an established law or order that I transgress, you know, which is the condition of possibility of jouissance is that there is an established law or order that I then transgress, you know. It's very much, I mean, Lacan adverts to it in Seminar 7. Mark will probably be theologically familiar with this, you know, the old notion of the Pauline notion that, you know, it's the law that begets sin in a way, you know. Without the law, there is no transgression, you know. So I think it could be said that Antigone may be caught up in this law plus transgression loop, if you like, you know. In other words, her jouissance is absolutely conditional upon a law, you know. And in that sense, maybe one could ask, is she a true revolutionary, you know? But then we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by revolutionary, you know? You know, is a revolutionary one who simply defies a law, like, you know, I mean, like an adolescent, like, you know, adolescent hijinks kind of, you know, I mean, you know, and so you can predict this kind of adolescent mentality or behavior because you know, if you order them to do something, you know, or the best way to get them to do something is to order them not to do something, and so on, you know. It's a kind of loop, like, you know, a kind of law plus defiance loop. Is that a revolutionary? Maybe not, you know. So I think that's a really interesting question. Which kind of it links in for me also to, or it links the notion of jouissance to something that seems to me to recede further and further and further into the background with late Lacan, with Miller, and so on. And that is the notion of desire. Okay, I'm really nostalgic for the notion of desire myself, you know, okay. And I hardly ever hear the word anymore, you know. So I'm a little bit old-fashioned like that, okay? Yeah. There's desire, of course. I think maybe Aaron brought it up last week, and I was really delighted to hear the word floated. But because we're talking about jouissance all the time, you know. But of course, we must also distinguish between the different kinds of jouissance, you know. I'm thinking of Miller's, you know, 6 paradigms and so on, like, you know, the notion of phallic jouissance, the jouissance of the idiot, speaking jouissance, simply to speak, as simply to be a body speaking, is a kind of jouissance also. I was really intrigued by your distinction between jouissance as such, which I think is a kind of viscerally rooted in the body, you know, and on the other hand, maybe surplus jouissance, which maybe for a long time I always thought was identical with jouissance. Like jouissance was always the surplus to any kind of utilitarian order of usefulness or any kind of homeostatic principle along the lines of the pleasure principle, you know. One last reflection. This is just a jumble of half thoughts, as I say. I just wonder what would your thoughts be that the notion of the one all alone and it's linked to jouissance, okay? A jouissance that dispenses with any kind of recognition by another, okay? In other words, a jouissance separated from desire, okay? In other words, what Miller has called, in fact, a cynical jouissance, okay? You know, a jouissance that does not need the other, you know? And he adverts to, you know, the most famous cynic of all, of course, perhaps Diogenes, you know, the ancient Greek cynic, who famously masturbated in the public square in order to demonstrate his self-sufficiency, you know. Okay, and some scholars have said that there was even a touch of this in not as graphic as that, but even a touch of this in Socrates himself, who, according to one commentary, I think it was one commentator said he liked to go to the marketplace to look at all the things that he didn't need. Okay, and got a thrill out of that. I don't need any of that bullshit, you know. You know, there's a kind of a cynical jouissance there, totally self-sufficient, you know. So I guess the big question for me at the moment, and has been for some time, is how are we to think the relation between jouissance and all these modalities and desire, you know? And that I think is very pertinent to the Antigone question also, you know. But thanks for the talk. Really interesting stuff. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'll leave it and think further. Thank you. Is it Fanny? Fannis? Fannis.
Thank you, Duane, for the seminar. It was very interesting. Regarding this division of the ethical subject, taking an example from Antigone and relating either to a revolutionary or fascist archetype, I think that drawing from Zupanči's Ethics of the Real, she makes a statement there that's very clearly indicating that the contemporary equivalent of Antigone would be a fundamentalist ISIS terrorist, not sacrificing anything for his belief, going forward in a suicide mission and living his life in this kind of way. And she makes an argument drawing from Kant's concepts and philosophy of a different kind of what she terms a revolutionary subject, and how this can be related, taking the Claudel's story of Signe de Pont-Fontaine, of being able to sacrifice precisely the only thing that establishes and founds your ethical duty. And I think that this is like a very interesting concept, and I don't 100% agree with it. I'm still contemplating and figuring out the ramifications that this might have. But taking this argument in our conversation and how we can now conceptualize or articulate an ethical revolutionary event, act, or whatever, this draws a very interesting subtlety of how one can conceive a truly revolutionary act. And I don't know how we can put this in modern examples and try to figure out how we can make a theory or an argument of that's how the revolutionary subject exists and moves forward. But I think that there is a lot of food for thought in this direction. Thank you.
That's really thought-provoking. Can I ask you a follow-up? I'm not familiar with this argument from Alenka. Maybe I've read it and just forgot it. When you say sacrifice, I wonder if sacrifice is homologous with what earlier I was saying, offering oneself up to be rejected. You know, to offer oneself up to be rejected to the other.
Yes, and in this sense, you mean to create like a proper subject, to be a proper act of subjectification.
Yeah. And so instead of witnessing politics, to put it simply, instead of witnessing the unconscious out in the field, you subjectivize and you invented unconscious. And so in some sense, you know, it requires, if I'm hearing you correctly, and I admit I might not be, I hear you in my own way, of course, is that you offer yourself up to be rejected to the other, precisely to enter the Freudian field, or to enter the field, sorry. But then it's a question of, well, you know, like you said, there's a question of the theory of revolutionary theory at that point. You know, from that point going on, like how can you construct some sort of thanks, Aaron. Thanks again for the amazing. Oh, is Aaron already gone? Yeah. How you can build a sort of a theory out of that. And I think, you know, more than that right now, instead of theorizing, at least for me, and I'm tempted, I'm very tempted to try and build some sort of revolutionary theory or whatever. Maybe we already have all the revolutionary theories that we need, in a sense, already out there somewhere that we need to discover. But it's more about making it even possible for there to be a politics at this point. And because the real problem, I think, right now is that we have a crisis of politics. There's a real political crisis right now. And I think if we're going to move forward, it will have to involve something of this notion of maybe what you're calling sacrifice, or offering yourself up to be rejected or something. And maybe it's even what, in some sense, we can call love. So
can I say one quick thing on Fanis's very interesting reminder regarding the modern Antigone, who is preferred by Lacan in some sense, and maybe has more appropriate political application, which is precisely Claudel's De Couffoy-Montaigne, which is a figure who I understand is somebody that basically does something kind of close to Bartleby from Herman Melville, which is immediately a form of politics that I think, practically speaking, speaking about saturation, is not interesting to me. Bartleby politics, I think, has saturated. It's no longer evident that it's useful. Okay, but what, and I would invite Fennis to maybe reiterate the lesson of Claudel's harrowing, if you don't mind, because isn't it also about a rejection of the coordinates of the decision itself, or something about the ethical act involving a revelation regarding the arbitrary basis of the ethical act? It's a kind of strange. Can you? It's not fresh to me, and maybe it would benefit others if you don't mind elaborating, because it's very, very often missed in Lacanian studies how central the playwright Paul Claudel is to Lacan's ethics, his later ethics. Would you mind elaborating a little, Fennis?
Real quick before you do that, Fennis, there's just something I just remembered. Antigone's name, it means to be in place of one's parents, doesn't it? In any case, go ahead, Fennis. Thank you.
There is a relation with that, as you said, like Antigonos in Greek means sort of going in place of your parents or something like that. And I think that precisely in Sophocles' play, this is the reason, because Antigone doesn't just break Creon's law. It's also how she tries to break the curse of her family, the Atti of originating from Oedipus and hunting down the generation of parents and siblings of Antigone, and how she can stop this by simultaneously transgressing these both limits. Back now to Signe de Cofontaine. She was trying to remain loyal to whatever regime was during her time and oppose the revolution or whatever. And she was willing to sacrifice anything and everything for that cause, even marry the person who blackmailed her, who was a revolutionary, who injured her cousin, who she wanted to marry initially, and all these things. And during the end of the play, when she has the opportunity to witness the vengeance or whatever of that person that took everything from her and forced her into marrying him, and also and so on and so on, she falls in the trajectory of the bullet that is aimed for his chest and saves his life. So in this sense, I think that the really revolutionary aspect of the whole story is that through this act, Signe de Cofontaine emerges as a new subject, as a subject which we couldn't be able to conceptualize before this act.
Fennis, who is Antigone sacrificing for?
Not Antigone, Signe de Cofontaine.
Oh, apologies. Okay.
I made the transition.
Yeah, this is the Claudel play.
Yeah. So she sacrifices her own life to save the person who, let's say, personifies all the troubles and things that she's against. And through this act, which is also some kind of ineffable act, because in the last pages of Claudel, she doesn't elaborate. Like he asks her why you did this, and she just has like a grimace on her face that is ambiguous and who knows what. And I think that this is the act that produces a new subject of Signe de Cofontaine from what she was previously to that. And that's like the inherent revolutionary aspect.
Very interesting. Yeah. Beautiful. Maybe we should go to Gabriel. I just want to say we have to close in 20 minutes, if it's okay. Gabriel?
I apologize if my question is idiosyncratic in terms of its reference. I'm wondering however, if for the sake of argument, Antigone might be a fascist, I'm not sure that I would say so, but I can't help wondering, what does that make Creon? Is Creon then, I suppose, a liberal? He doesn't seem to embody revolutionary Marxism or communism. It seems to me he would then be a technocratic liberal, transgressing the traditions that Antigone stands for. And so I'm then wondering, is there something to the right of liberalism, but to the left of fascism? Is there something to the right of Joe Biden or to the right of the EU, but to the left of fascism? And when I saw Creon for a moment as Joe Biden or whatever Joe Biden represents, I was trying to think of a contemporary point of reference for Antigone in that framework. And this is the idiosyncratic part. I was on a long train ride the other day, and I listened to about 6 hours of the podcast Red Scare. Has anybody else ever heard of this? And I wondered if Antigone might not be something like these kind of new right girls who embrace their femininity in it with all the jouissance, I guess, that you could ever want if you listen to them take pleasure in transgressing all the politically correct norms. That's what they do on that podcast, in juxtaposition to an authoritarian liberalism that, you know, today we call woke. We used to call it politically correct. And well, I'm then left wondering how to make sense of that kind of a gesture, which today I associate with the post-liberal order types, people like Patrick Deneen or Compact magazine, which Slavoj Zizek is one of the editors or on the editorial board of. What does it mean when revolutionary acts seem to come from the right in an age in which liberalism is hegemonic? If that makes any sense to anyone else, or is that just too I don't know, too inappropriate to ask in this context? There's a jouissance of the right today, I would say, that is maybe fascistic or maybe just to the left of fascism, but clearly to the right of the Republican Party in the days of people like McCain and Romney. They seem to put their foot down firmly in favor of the family and tradition and norms that precede the liberal sort of technocratic state. If she were a fascist, I guess again I would just say then what, who and what is Creon? I guess if I could put it that way again. Does one have a right to protest Creon's, power? I mean, I guess obviously the play suggests that there's a tragic conflict between the two. I'm not one who feels it's necessary to choose between the two. I'm just an old-fashioned Hegelian in this sense. I would see it as a tragedy per se. These are opposing, elements that each make a claim on us if we're aware of their claims. But I wonder what you might say, Duane, or
It's just the idea of Antigone being a fascist. I think you can get too caught up in the idea of what that. But I think it's more about recognizing how we participate in fascism generally just by being in the world that we're in. And I think I'm interested in this idea of how we all get caught up in sort of the imaginary, as Louis pointed out, the imaginary aspect of capitalism. to the extent that we think we're engaging in the act, but ultimately we end up engaging in the deprivation of the world, or the degradation of the world. And I think that's it's the question for me is the very possibility of Antigone a real thing today? And for me, I mean, like my own work, I'm trying to go beyond. I argue that we can find a better figure in Julian of Norwich, but that's my thing. And because I believe that Antigone, unlike Antigone, goes into the cave alive, and she says no. And Julian of Norwich goes into her cell dead. She dies to the world. She's already in the fullness of death, and she recognizes that the law is already gone. She can't even look up to the law or God. She looks at the bleeding body as she's having a shout, and it's in that enjoyment from there that she reaches out and invents a new social bond. And so it's in a type of revelation that appears rather than revolution. But this is stuff that I'm playing around with, and I'll try and talk about it a little bit more when I've formulated. But I definitely think it's been. I think the big question for me in this are Antigones possible today? That's what I think anyway. Thank you, Gabriel.
Just a final sort of point, because when we say fascism, of course, I think it's one of these expressions maybe we associate it with a particular meaning, and one of the arguments that I've been trying to make is that there's a logic of fascism that operates within the domain of the signifier. I think it's kind of there when we talk about Nazism. There's very clear prohibitions. I mentioned it last time in the anti-Semitic legislation, it's an explicit prohibition. But what I've tried to argue in some of my work is that you can achieve the same results when the prohibition isn't functioning, and when you have affirmations of jouissance. And those results can happen in really devastating ways, as they have in the example I always cite for Muslims in India recently, for example. I would call it a form of fascism that occurs through affirmations and implicit prohibitions rather than explicit prohibitions. And so it's a question of how fascism can operate in the register of enjoyment. And in that register, when we talk about sacrifice, I think it can often appear as a Fawning, which means as a false sacrifice. You sacrifice for whom? Who are you sacrificing for? Your brothers, maybe your comrades, your uncles, or something like that. And so it's just a minor point maybe, but maybe we could stop, folks. Is that okay?
Thank you, Duane. Thank you, Daniel, for and thank you.
Beautiful, yeah, and it's been fun. It's just really great. I'm so excited that we're doing this, honestly. And Duane, thank you. This has been, I mean, so thought-provoking. It's like I feel that I need these kinds of interventions in my life. Maybe we can just keep it going, Duane, every week. But same time next week, everyone? Is that the plan? And sorry, one final message before we send off. We have the Zizek conference. Send me a message if you want to get on the Zoom for it. It's already sold out. We can only fit 100 on our Zoom. I haven't paid for the big expensive version of the Zoom. Maybe I should. But I'd like for all of you to be there with us. So I still have some seats available. Just send me a message.
This is important. How do we get in this?
All right. How you get in? Okay. Let me I'll just hold tight. I'm gonna send a link right now. Give me 1 second. I really do think, though, this neo-feudal thing and Red Scare is the best way to read the phenomenon of Red Scare. The other interesting thing with Red Scare, in my opinion, is that they only recently became known as right wing
Yeah,
within the last few months.
they were for Bernie Sanders at one point. At least one of
They
them.
still are. No, they still are.
Yeah,
The issue is different. It's in my view, the total collapse of progressive liberalism in its ability to deliver on the Biden phenomenon has resulted in any deviations from that as being right, which is really, talk about tragedy. That's tragic. So, but okay, are they right wing? That's a whole other thing, because there's this huge debate we're having right now about this new literary movement within Manhattan, which is more interesting than Red Scare. Red Scare is kind of a part of it, but it's like these new like plays and writers and up and coming bohemian intellectuals in Manhattan through like the Dime Square group. I don't know if you've heard of it, and they are not anti-politics, but there's something close to anti-politics. So what we're seeing is a kind of intellectual anti-politics emerge, which is privileging aesthetics and abandoning both socialism and liberalism. We have a history of that, and it's not great. Anyways, you know what I mean? It's not ideal. But that link there, Gabriel, is to the, you can register there.
will do. Will do. So my question wasn't totally idiosyncratic.
No, it was a really great question. Yeah. On my podcast, we discuss this all the time because we are very.
Oh, I got to listen to your podcast.
Yeah,
Can you
we're
send it
always
back
in
to-
this. We're
I'm
in
sorry,
there.
I'm totally out of it. I need to get into your podcast. How do we get that?
Oh, well, sure. Let me send you a little link here. Yeah, I got you. I got
Awesome.
you. Well, this has been great, Duane. Really honored. There's the link to the podcast. Okay. All the best, everyone. Peace out. Bye-bye.